dense, but it should be good. All right. Now, as I mentioned, there are, at the end of the 19th century, you have significant changes in modern society. Most importantly, the spread of the Industrial Revolution from Britain across Europe, across the world. And part of the reason for that is the end of the Napoleonic Wars, so that economies can develop. They could borrow ideas from neighboring countries, and there wasn't this concentration on just war, war, war. Now, there's two major consequences to industrialization as it expands globally. The first you read about in your first paper that mentioned women were moving to the cities, they were working in factories, they were exposed to new ideas, new cultures, and in some cases you have this rise in illegitimacy, which is tied to industrialization, if not to a change in the way women thought about family, etc. The other consequence of having so many people move to the cities and working in factories and living in the same neighborhoods is that workers started to, as more and more women were modernizing, moving to cities, seeing the condition of their lives, living from the experiences of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, and seeing where their inequality was at, you have the birth of feminism in the 19th century. The other movement, which I'll talk about in 2 weeks from now, socialism, is a similar movement on the part of workers that felt they did not have equality of status or rights or opportunity. So the ideas of the Enlightenment about equality are manifested in the 19th century, not just in liberalism, but also in feminism and socialism. And so today, I want to talk about the change of women's situations and the rise of feminism and the women's rights movement. Now, the Industrial Revolution wasn't great for women, because not only were women now working in factories, getting paid less than men, but it also changed the nature of work. Before, when women would work at home as part of the family economy, whatever women did at home was considered equally important to the men and everyone else that worked together to make the family survive. But once work was equated with actual pay, because more and more people worked in factories, the work that was done at home by women was no longer considered to be equally valued. It was considered to be just, that's what you do. You're a woman. You clean the house. You clean the kids. You cook the food. Before, it was a critical part of the family economy. Now it was just what women, quote unquote, naturally did, because it's unpaid and it's not respected. Now, of course, you would say, but if the woman wasn't there, you'd have to hire a babysitter and a house cleaner. You'd have to pay them. You're getting this labor for free in a woman. Yes, but back then it was argued that's just our natural role in society. Man works, woman stays at home and does those things. But what if women work as well? Well, they have to do that stuff at home anyway. So the Industrial Revolution it did, like Edward Shorter said, give women new access to new jobs, move to the city, etc., but also came with added hardships, which the no side of that argument mentioned. And with women in industry, yes, they would have their own income. If they were living away from home, they could even control those wages if they weren't sending them back home. But this wasn't a great life. As you saw from the articles, women were paid less, but also these jobs were very unskilled in the factories if they were going to work in factories. And because they were unskilled, they were easily fired and easily replaceable. Many of these jobs were seasonal, so when the season was over and the labor was no longer needed, they would just be let go, and they would be stuck in this cycle of poverty, not being able to raise anything. With the Industrial Revolution, there also was a development in what's called white-collar women. You have the growth of factories, the growth of cities, but also governments expand in order to regulate these cities. Corporations expand during the 19th century. And in all of these cases, more and more women are entering the low-level secretarial, white-collar professions, where it's not manual labor like working in a factory, it's office work. But because it's low-level, secretarial, later on typists, later on phone operators, low-level, low-skill, low-pay, easily replaceable, just like if they were working in a factory. Again, it's a better job than working in a factory if you're like a secretary at a corporation or you're a clerk in a department store, but there's not a whole lot of money there to save and pass on to a next generation. One of the professions that women did expand to because of the modernization of society was teaching. As more and more people moved to the cities, out of the countryside, as there was a greater and greater demand for workers having the basics of reading, writing, and math skills, because even if it was unskilled work in a factory, you still needed a basic education to read manuals, to know when to clock in, to clock out, how to just follow policies. This basic education to these millions of people moving from the countryside to the city meant there was an expansion in public schooling, paid for by the government to give people basic education. In order to fill that space for basic, low-level, elementary, primary school teachers, women were brought into the workforce as these primary school teachers to teach basic reading, writing, and arithmetic to meet the needs of a modern economy. But the problem was, even though this was education, it was still considered low level, not very respected, not very well paid, and there's a reason why so many women were in these professions, because men just didn't want to get into them. They were considered to be like the lowest of the low jobs. So, whether you were working in a factory or whether you were working in a more professional job, secretary, clerk, typist, teacher, the 19th century, the era of the Industrial Revolution and all this talk about equality and modernization, it just wasn't good for women. And the part that really hurt women the most was something called the cult of domesticity. When you have this expansion of factories, of wealth, of the middle class, there is a growth of this group of people, the middle classes, where the men who have made so much money owning or working for corporations or factories or whatever the case may be, can simply pay their family debts without their wives and their children having to work. This becomes a mark of status for middle class and wealthy men, that I make so much money that my family, my wife, my children, they don't have to work. Unlike the working class, where everybody in the family has to work to survive. The mark that I've made it, that I am a member of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, or the wealthy, is that my wife and children don't have to work. I can cover the full family budget. The problem is, though, this ideal, and let me take a step back. Since my wife doesn't have to work, she can devote her time to her natural duties, child rearing, etc., etc. The problem with this ideal, that the woman can stay home and raise the kids and take care of the house, is that it wasn't good for any woman. For those women who their husband worked a lot and they didn't have to work themselves, they weren't even allowed to work if they wanted to, nor did they have access to college or post-secondary education, because the assumption was you're supposed to stay at home and watch your kids. there's no expectation for you to do anything else. For those women that had to work because their husbands simply didn't make enough money or they were single, they were judged based on this ideal that as a woman, your primary role should be wife and mother. You shouldn't have to be working. So they were not only struggling under the weight of bad pay, no respect, but then they were struggling under the weight of this stigma that they should be fulfilling their natural roles of just being a wife and a mother, even if economically that was impossible. Now, these things here, economic limitations, social barriers, as in family law only benefited the man, not the woman, all of this lack of education, this is all in your PowerPoints, leads us to the birth of feminism, what I was talking about at the beginning of this class. And what I was saying in general at the beginning of the class was that you have all this talk about in the French Revolution, equality, equality, equality. Remember, the rights of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It talks with universal language, but there's no women in there. The Enlightenment talked about universal equality, but most of the philosophers that we talked about in this class were all men. Based on the ideas that came out of the French Revolution, liberalism, women challenged their exclusion from equality very early on. For instance, in France, a woman by the name of Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman in September of 1791. Here she was. When did she die? 2 years after she published the Declaration of the Rights of Woman. The Declaration of the Rights of Woman, like the Declaration of Sentiments, took an established document and said, this is what you believe. But what happens if we actually add the woman, the name woman, or the word woman? Really make it equal, referring to men and women. Even at the time of the French Revolution, where people were being massacred by the thousands in defense of liberty and justice, this idea of full gender equality was considered too radical. And she was executed in 1793 for being an enemy of the revolution by demanding even more than the revolutionaries were comfortable with. Remember, these are the people that killed their king and set off war that engulfed Europe to spread liberty and equality. But a woman saying equal rights was too much, right? And in your PowerPoint, I put some samples of the opening words, and what you'll see is that all of these things are very similar to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, except she writes the word and woman, and woman, and woman. She's essentially specifying, if you're talking about equality, well then put woman in there and be clear about it. Well, she got killed for that. Other instances of feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft, who published her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, has simply said, don't judge women on gender, judge women based on their merits and their abilities. Well, how do we know what a woman's ability is? Well, give them equal access to education, and then have an open playing field. Everybody competes for the same positions. Whoever gets it because of their merit, not because of their gender. John Stuart Mill and his wife Harriet Taylor. Mill is the godfather of liberalism in England. He wrote the books that defined what liberalism was. Well, they also wrote together The Subjection of Women in 1869, and he came out and he said, flat out, when I talk about equality, when I talk about all citizens have these rights, I am specifically referring to both genders, not just men, as my predecessors have done. Now, in the American women's rights movement, we briefly touched on it with this Declaration of Sentiments. So let me talk about the British women's rights movement, and then I'll do a recap after the midterm. In Britain, British feminism had two wings. One was very moderate. Millicent Fawcett, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. They wanted women to have the right to vote, because if you give women the right to vote, everything else will follow. Because once you put women in parliament, then they will pass laws that are good for women, like equal pay and all that kind of stuff. Millicent Fawcett tried to convince Parliament, all men, to grant the right to vote peacefully, lobbying peacefully. She got nowhere. None of these guys believe a woman was capable, independent enough, trustworthy enough to have the vote, regardless of their education. They were happy giving the vote to all men, regardless of wealth and education, but to women, they wouldn't have any of it. Emmeline Pankhurst formed the Women's Social and Political Union, and she took a much more violent approach, one that I'm somewhat partial to. She decided if the men are not paying attention to our casual, rational discussion, then let's just cause as much trouble as possible. So this group would go on marches, stop traffic, vandalize stores, break into government meetings, and throw food on the politicians while they're talking. They would be arrested. They would go on hunger strikes while in prison, just to cause as much of a stink as possible so that people can no longer ignore the issue of women don't have the right to vote. None of this worked. The only thing that worked was in World War I, when all the men were sent to fight, and then the women were told, we need you to work in the factories. We need you to work in the post office. We need you to drive the buses and the cars and the trolleys, all traditional men's work. But we need you to do your right as a citizen and work on behalf of the war effort. Well, obviously, when the war was over, these women that were treated as citizens would now come back and say, well, we did our part, where's our vote? And so the vote was duly given because you could no longer deny it. This is a similar trajectory for America, but I'll talk about that after the midterm. Thank you. Hand in your stuff on the way out. I'll see you Wednesday for the midterm review. Please remember to print out the actual